Welcome to Tech Talk X by Digital at INSEAD. Our topic for this session is safety versus privacy. Do we have to choose? And it's great to see so many alumni, staff, students, and friends present from all around the world. Based on the pre-survey, over 50% of our audience, you, have very little or no experience with blockchain. So this will surely be an informative discussion. Let's first get to know our panel members. So first, we've got Andrea Canidio. He's a fellow at the Research Center, the Stone Research Center at INSEAD, where he teaches game theory to MBA students. He is also an assistant professor of economics at IMT School for Advanced Studies in Italy, where he teaches microeconomics to PhD students. His research interests are development economics, inequality, innovation, entrepreneurship, contracts, organization, and blockchain. He earned his PhD in economics from Boston University. Matt McGuire is the co-founder and practice leader with the AML Shop. He is an internationally recognized expert in anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, and sanctions. He has been assisting financial institutions to assess and reduce financial crime and related regulatory risks for over 15 years. Matt has served as an advisor to the Canadian and foreign governments on development of their laws and financial intelligence functions, and as a consultant to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. He's an instructor of numerous courses, including those on trade-based money laundering. And lastly, myself. I'm the managing partner at Blockchain Founders Fund, which invests in and venture builds top-tier startups and consults organizations such as the United Nations. I'm a limited partner at Loyal VC, an author of 3 books, and recognized as a Blockchain 100 global leader by Lattice 80. I'm also a senior blockchain fellow at INSEAD. Now for our session, we're going to be exploring the digital technologies and how they're taking a central role in the COVID-19 crisis. Technology companies, together with governments, are multiplying efforts to respond to the pandemics and its collaterals globally. In the race to end the calamity, many questions are emerging on the future of the digital economy, business, management, and society post-pandemics. This new series of Tech Talks explores how COVID-19 crisis is reshaping the global digital transformation and features INSEAD faculty and researchers in the conversation with leading industry practitioners and thought leaders from our global community. And so first, we'll actually be doing a presentation by Andrea Canidio, and then we'll move into our panel with Matt McGuire, Andrea, and myself. And for Andrea, he'll be discussing how COVID-19 crisis has impacted our privacy for the sake of public health, how technology and regulation can help balance privacy and public health. Andrea will first give us an overview of our personal freedom, more specifically the boundaries of each of us, our personal freedoms, and how technology, including blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, can help us better shape those boundaries. Please welcome Andrea.
Thank you, Ali. You should be able to see my slides now. Yes, okay. So thank you, Ali. It's an absolute pleasure to share the virtual floor with you and Matt and to open this discussion. Now, when we think about the relationship between technology and privacy, we typically think of how technology is making it easier to collect our personal data and therefore reduce our privacy. A case in point would be the current discussion about facial recognition. But today, I would like to discuss a different issue, that is how technology can actually help us to achieve privacy, can help us regulate what we share and how much we share. And in particular, how blockchain technology, which is something that came out relatively recently, I will argue can be used to manage at least some type of our personal data in a way that is both secure and private. And the big takeaway from my presentation is that I think we should do much more to speed up its adoption. And so, you know, the title of this hour-long discussion is the question, do we need to choose between privacy and safety? And I decided to start my presentation with what I believe to be the answer, which is a qualified no, meaning that for certain type of data, we do not need to choose. We can have both, thanks to blockchain. For other types of data, as you will see, things are a little bit more complicated. Now, sorry, okay. Now, what do we talk when we talk about privacy, okay? Now, privacy is about our personal freedom, and especially the boundaries of our personal freedom. Okay, we don't understand that our behavior may have an impact on other members of the community, and therefore some of our behavior may need to be regulated, which requires that some of our personal data are accessible by public authorities. This could be public health authorities or the police. But importantly, there is also a sphere of our life that is fully private. And within this sphere, we can do whatever we want, and hence there is no reason for the government to collect our data. Now, the important observation is that the ability to share some of our personal data, but not other, depends crucially on the technology that is available. And before getting into advanced stuff such as blockchain, I would like to illustrate this point by bringing up a technology that is very old, very well understood, and absolutely nothing fancy, which is a speed camera, right? Now, nobody likes speed cameras, and sometimes they're used unfairly. Nonetheless, I think we need to recognize that overall, this is a useful technology. Absent speed cameras, most people will probably drive at a reasonable speed, but few people will not, and those few will put everyone else in danger. So that's why we need speed cameras. So how do speed cameras work? Now, at least the simplest, the standard type of speed camera has a sensor that measures speed, and I believe this is done using microwaves. Anyway, and then we'll take a picture only of those who drive above a certain speed. Now, going back to the idea that privacy is achieved when you sometimes have to share your personal data, but sometimes you do not have to share your personal data. I think this is in a case in which this happens, right? Because if you're putting other people in dangers, then you will need to share certain data with the police, meaning that you are at a given time in a given place and obviously driving at a certain speed. But otherwise, the government doesn't care and doesn't record where you are going, what you're doing. Okay, you are totally invisible to the government. And this, I mean, somewhat surprisingly, we can think of therefore speed cameras as a sort of ideal, a benchmark when it comes to technology that allow to achieve privacy. Now, let me also spend a couple of minutes on what I believe it's not privacy. I think it's important to remember that. Now, obviously, this situation is not privacy. So this is a situation where the government has access to all your personal data. And obviously, this is bad news if you live in North Korea or in a country like North Korea, because the more the government has access to your personal data, the more it will use its access to enforce certain behavior and punish those that don't comply with this behavior. And most people will say, okay, I don't live in North Korea, so why should I care? But I will argue that this is a problem also if you live in a democracy, because once your data, your personal data are on some server somewhere in a government office, then this database, so this data may be hacked or misused in some other ways. Think about a jealous husband who also happens to be a policeman. And also, we may be in a democracy right now, but once collected, those data will sit there for many, many years, and who knows who will be in power in 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Therefore, knowing that your data will be collected, even if today we live in a democracy and you may be confident that the government won't misuse this data, may still end up affecting the way you behave, effectively reducing your personal freedom. Also, just as a side note, I framed the discussion in terms of you sharing data with the government, but because I believe that this is the most interesting angle given the current pandemic. But the same logic applies to sharing data with companies or private entities. Okay, so obviously sharing carries costs, carries risks, because the data you share may be misused, may be hacked, may be resold. But of course, we need to share some data if you want to receive a service, if you want this private organization to perform their role. Okay, so again, it's the same logic of finding a way in which you can share something, but not too much. And finally, I believe that this situation is also not privacy. Okay, this is essentially secrecy. This is a situation in which these are the people who would encrypt everything, use Tor, VPN, and whatnot when they are online, so that the government cannot access any of their personal data. Now, those people will claim that this situation, secrecy, is better than the Big Brother case I had just before. And I may agree with this, but in my opinion, it's important to keep in mind that the ideal we're trying to achieve is not secrecy, but it's privacy, as I defined earlier. Now, privacy in the digital era has been notoriously difficult to achieve, but luckily now we have a relatively new technology that can help a great deal with that, which is blockchain. So I know most people here are not familiar with blockchain, so let me just give you a one-slide summary of what's blockchain. Right, so blockchain is a technology that allows a network to maintain a data, so a data set, in a way that is publicly verifiable and also immutable. So let me go slowly through each of these four important elements. First of all, blockchain is about a network. So it's a collaboration between different entities or different individuals. The original application of blockchain, which is Bitcoin, in that application, in that implementation, anybody can join the network because anybody can start mining Bitcoin, anybody can start sending or receiving Bitcoin. But for our purposes, so blockchain for managing personal data, private data, this network is usually formed by essentially a consortium, so a group of organizations, some public institutions and private institutions, that collaborate in maintaining a data set. And again, in the original application of blockchain, this data were essentially financial data, transaction data, but it turns out that the same technology can be applied to maintaining any type of data, including personal data, in a way that is publicly verifiable, in a sense that anybody can go online and check not only what are the current states of what is the current state of this data maintained by the network, but also the full history, its full history. So for example, not only how the data now, but also the way they were a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And finally, immutability is also a very important concept here. This, of course, we can change the data that are on the blockchain, like any system. It would be pretty useless if we couldn't then change those data. And so we can add stuff to the blockchain, we can remove stuff from the blockchain, so on and so forth. What is important here is that the history of how we've edited those data is immutable. So of course I can upload something on the blockchain, and then 3 months down the line I can change it, of course, no problem, but it's immutable. The fact that anybody can check that I did something 3 months ago and then I changed it 2 months later. Okay. Now, so how can we use blockchain to handle personal data? Now, this really depends on which type of data we're talking about. And I will split the discussion into two. On the one hand, we have third-party generated personal data. This would be like your driving license, your medical record. Essentially, those are personal data, but you do not create them, right? Driving license is issued by government bodies, and your medical records, these are composed of your lab results or whatever. This is created by a hospital or by a lab. On the other hand, we have user-generated personal data. So the personal data that you generate yourself. And this could be browsing history or location data. I will discuss both, but in short, we already have the technologies to manage third-party generated personal data using blockchain. The problem here is mostly how to fit this technology within the current regulatory framework. And by the way, Matt, who is also on the panel, is an expert on that. We, however, lack the technology to handle user-generated personal data. Now, this presentation was born out of an article that I wrote that became an insert knowledge article that also started work with two computer scientists, Gabriele Costa and Letterio Galletta, with whom I've collaborated before in designing a blockchain protocol, but for something else unrelated to this discussion. Anyway, the point here is that we are now exploring how you can use blockchain also to handle user-generated personal data. The bottom line, I will explain you what are the ideas that we are exploring. But the bottom line here is going to be that we think it can be done, but more research is needed. Now, let's start with the third-party generated personal data. Now, I'm going to give you a very, very rough sketch of how it works. Now, the basic idea is that the organization generating a piece of data will publish its hash on the blockchain. Now, what is the hash of a piece of data? Well, you can think of it as a cryptographic summary of a piece of data. So essentially, you're going to take a file, an image, a text, or anything, really just data, and you're going to run it through what is called a hash function. A hash function is an algorithm that is going to take the initial data and perform several manipulations, and it's going to spit out a hash. So the hash corresponding to this initial piece of data. It is going to be like a long string of numbers and letters. Now, the important thing is, oh, I forgot. So, and this is fully deterministic in the sense that if you take again the same file or the same data, these are going to spit out again the exact same hash, okay? But if you take a different file, a different image, the hash you're going to get is going to be different. And importantly, you cannot perform the same operation in reverse. So if I tell you a hash corresponding to some data, you are not going to be able to figure out which data generated this hash. Okay, this is a cryptographic primitive. So you can do it only one way, but you really cannot do it the other way. So knowing this, let me explain how it works. So to stay with the current pandemic, let's consider the example of David, who wants to know whether he already had COVID-19 and is therefore now supposedly immune. Now, this could be out of curiosity, so that he can worry less about having his mask or not. But maybe, now there are a lot of ideas floating around, such as that if there is ever a second wave and we all have to go back into lockdown, there's going to be some sort of immunity passport, meaning that the government will allow those who are immune to the virus to continue circulating, continue working, continue their life as before. Now, I think this is a terrible idea, but let's stick to this example, okay? So now, David, okay, goes to the lab, the lab takes his blood and checks for presence of antibodies, and then share the test result. Okay, this is shared digitally, okay? It could be maybe on an app, so a file or something that has to do with an app, and these are private. Simultaneously, he's gonna take the hash of the test result and upload this hash on a blockchain. Now remember that the blockchain is public, so anybody can see this hash and anybody can see that the hospital uploaded this hash, and it's also immutable, so after it's uploaded, nobody can change it. But of course, just by looking at the hash, no one can really figure out what is the data that generated that hash, okay? And so there is no disclosure of information there. So now what happened? David walks around during a lockdown, and he's stopped by a policeman. And now what he does is basically show this guy his test result, maybe by showing something on his phone. Now the policeman can take those data, compute their hash, its hash, and then check it against the hash that was uploaded on the blockchain by the hospital. And this way, he's able to tell whether what David is showing him is indeed authentic. So it's indeed the test result that were given out by the hospital or not, okay? And note how, in fact, now we can verify whether David is immune or not and can circulate or not without having a big database with everyone's name on it and everybody kind of health history on it. So this is just showed on the spot to the policeman, who doesn't even need really to record it anywhere. So David can continue walking around, and maybe in 20 minutes another policeman stop him and repeat the same thing, right? So in some sense, with zero data collected and stored by the government. Now, the same thing can be done in a situation where, in fact, it's the government, which issues a piece of personal data, for example, a digital passport, and issues to David the file corresponding to the digital passport, and then simultaneously upload its hash on the blockchain. And now say David needs to open a bank account, he can share this digital passport, maybe even via an email, with the bank. The bank is going to compute the hash of this file that it receives and compare it with what's uploaded on the blockchain to verify its authenticity. And if the two hash match, then they must infer that what David is showing them is indeed what was issued initially by the police. And here is another interesting thing. So in this scheme, because the passport, as is conceived now, is in fact a bundle of personal information. There is, of course, your name, your nationality, where it was issued, your age, so on and so forth. Now we can think of, in fact, unbundling all those pieces of information so that each of these piece of information has its own file and has its own hash on the blockchain, so that say that David only needs to show that he is a national of country X and he is above 18, he's going to share only those two pieces of information with the bank instead of sharing his entire passport. And so now we really have the kind of the minimal amount of information sharing necessary in order to then open a bank account and do whatever he wants to do with the bank. Okay, so let's now instead move to blockchain for handling user-generated personal data. And here I will focus mostly on the location data in the context of contact tracing, given the current events. But most of the discussion, I believe, extend also to other types of user-generated personal data. Now, right now, there are in fact two options currently available. Now, there are the Chinese style, for lack of a better term, contact tracing app, which essentially are apps that you have to install on your phone, and they just collect all your data, all your location data, and continuously upload those data on a central server, which is used by the government for the purpose of contact tracing. And this, I think, perfectly fits the definition of Big Brother that I had earlier. There are then privacy-preserving contact tracing apps. Now, they work in this way. A user downloading an app, so there are many flavors, there are many different, slightly different implementation, but roughly speaking, they all work in the following way. You install the app, and the app generates a random number, which is your identifier on the network, but it's random, so no one can tie it to your identity. And then there is a system by which, when people are in close proximity, they are going to exchange some codes via Bluetooth. Then what happens is that if I am diagnosed with COVID-19, I'm going to alert the network, and somehow, depending on the implementation, all the other people who were in contact with me, essentially that have my code saved on their phone, will be alerted that they had a dangerous encounter. Okay. Now, however, what is the problem with this? Is that the user is notified of a dangerous encounter and that he might be infectious to COVID, even if he doesn't have symptoms. Nonetheless, there is no way for anybody to know this. So essentially, this is totally private, and therefore the person is left to decide by himself whether to indeed follow appropriate behavior, meaning staying at home, or instead going partying. And I believe this is not a choice that should be left totally to the single individual. There are plenty of examples of people who were told to stay home and then went to parties, ended up infecting many people. So this inability to monitor whether people follow the prescribed behavior is, in my opinion, problematic. What is missing is something like a private but verifiable contact tracing app, which is what we're working on. So let me describe you very rapidly what is the idea behind. Consider David. David has his location history saved on his phone. This is already the case. You just need to open your map app on your phone. However, simultaneously, his phone every, say, half an hour takes the hash of his location history and uploads it on the blockchain. Then if David tests positive, he will have to share his location history with the public health authorities that will then verify this location history by checking on the blockchain. And let's say that this scheme is added on top of one of those privacy-preserving contact tracing apps I had described earlier. Now, what is the outcome of all this? Well, say that David meets a friend for coffee, and then a few days later, this friend Napoleon falls sick with COVID-19. Now, because of this privacy-preserving contact tracing app, David will receive a notification that he had a dangerous encounter, and then have to decide whether to stay home or go to a party. Now, zoom forward a week. Now, David is sick with COVID-19, and David will have to share his location data with the health authority, and he cannot lie, meaning because his location data will be checked against the hash that was uploaded automatically by his application. And now we will know whether David was notified of a dangerous encounter and stayed home or not. And so if David complied, we can think about a monetary compensation. If David instead went to a party, then we can think of a fine, okay? So we can verify ex post whether David complied with the required behavior or not. And this is all achieved by sharing the location data, not of everybody, but only of those who turned out to fall sick of COVID-19. Again, this is an idea we're exploring, adding pieces, modifying, but just to give you the sense that it can be done. Finally, so to conclude, the issue of privacy and how to achieve it is clearly not new. I mean, in fact, it's a long-standing one. And the epidemic made it particularly salient because, you know, now our behavior are more interconnected than before. You know, until a few months ago, whether I wanted to leave my house to go to do some sport outdoor was considered 100% a private issue, and lately not so much, on the basis that I may spread the virus if I do so. Now, in any case, precisely because this issue of privacy is very salient right now, we now have a great opportunity, because changing the way we handle personal data is a coordinated change. You get the benefit of this new technology only if multiple organizations adopt it. And coordinated change is easier to achieve once everybody's mind is focused on the need to implement this change. And what is this change that we should implement? Well, for third-party generated personal data, we should accelerate the deployment of blockchain-based solutions. And for user-generated personal data, I believe we should invest more in research and development to find ways to handle them also in a private but secure way.
Thank you, Andrea, for that fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed your insights about how blockchain can be used for managing third-party and user-generated personal data. From your example, I really hope that David is doing better from COVID-19. And one part that I really liked is you said we don't need to choose between privacy and blockchain. We can have both. And so along with our audience, I'm curious about the impact on personal privacy, using this technology for good, and the regulations related to these situations. And so let's move right into the first part of our panel. And so, welcome, Matt, to the group. And so to kick this off, data gathering permissions have become a standard feature of quarantine enforcement at the expense of individual privacy. While much of the discussion about COVID-19 has been about leadership, crisis management, remote collaborations, and social norms, I want to focus on how quarantine efforts, which protects public health, are detrimental to privacy. Contact tracing apps rely on GPS data gathering on mass scale, while in Australia, several states have introduced or are debating laws that would force quarantine breakers to wear an electronic tracking device. Before we move to how the conversation around privacy and security is changing, we first want to talk about how individual privacy has been affected. So let's actually kick things off with a poll question with our audience. What do you care more about? Safety or privacy? And we'll give you a few seconds to answer. All right, so let's see what the results. Okay, so equally safety and privacy. Now, I think that'll be quite insightful and helpful for our panel members. And so, Andrea, earlier you presented on why we need to care about our personal data and privacy. And so how is individual privacy and how has it been affected by COVID-19?
So I think the answer to that question depends a lot of where you live. Okay, so obviously if you live in China or South Korea, those countries made a very clear choice early on to sort of disregard privacy in an attempt to contain the spread of the virus. So in those places, your privacy has been heavily affected. Okay. Now, a country like Singapore has decided something slightly milder. The official contact tracing app in Singapore is one that records, doesn't record location data, but records meeting between individuals, okay? So essentially, which are not anonymous at all. So the government knows whether you met Ali last week. Doesn't know where, but they will record that for the purpose of contact tracing. So it's a bit milder, so the set of data they collect is not so extensive as in China or other places. Still, there is a severe lack of privacy. In the Western world, for the moment, the apps that are they are rolling out contact tracing apps that are in the spirit of this privacy-preserving contact tracing app, which they indeed preserve privacy, but my concern is that they're going to be also ineffective. They have a lot of problem having to do with, which I didn't mention, with the fact that they tend to give a lot of false positive. But then what I already mentioned is that they leave totally up to the individual to be responsible and behave, stay home if they're notified that they were in contact with someone who developed COVID. And this again may turn out to be ineffective. And what worries me is that in the face of a new wave of epidemic, in the face of the fact that those apps turn out to be ineffective, we may then move very quickly toward the non-privacy preserving contact tracing app, the more toward the either the Chinese or the Singaporean style. So this is what worries me.
I definitely can see how that can be worrying, and I'm very curious on Matt's thoughts. But before we get to that, I'd like to move to another poll question to see what our audience is thinking about how concerned they are about sharing their personal data. Okay, and so 56% of our audience is concerned about sharing their personal data. And so Matt, given your expertise on privacy and identities, what personal data are we talking about, and how has this changed from pre-COVID?
Great question, and thanks for having me here. I think it's important, to start from the beginning to say that, health information itself, anything related to a person's health, is probably among the most sensitive private data that we hold, right? And so it evokes strong feelings, and so I'm not surprised by the poll results around concern, right? And the next important thing to remember is that, of course, this health information is critical to the protection of people's health itself. And so therein lies the quandary. But, in terms of information we collect, let's think back to 2011, right? So in 2011, the University of Cambridge introduced flu phone, where it was meant to track flu, and then the technology was a little bit different. So we were still focused on Bluetooth as a means to track distance. It was collecting information then about the devices that were around you through Bluetooth. So how long you were in contact with those devices. And then the bit that worked out less well and led to less adoption was the idea of collecting symptoms about your health, not just positive or not positive, but rather the symptoms, which was seen as slightly invasive. Now we're talking about far more GPS-enabled phone, and that's the additional information that's certainly tracked in this instance, right? You contrast that. China is a great example of how we're collecting more than that. When we get into facial recognition, it's not just about the collection of that data, but it's the comparison or the connection of that data with the other things we know about that person. That compounds the issue. I like to think about a little closer to home here. There's a city in New Jersey that has surveillance drones for contact tracing, right, and to see that people are behaving in the way that they're meant to. So the spectrum of information that can be collected is quite large, and it is very country specific at this point.
So how does this actually affect our individual privacy? Because of course there's potentially certain benefits to this as well.
Yeah. So all of the problem here about the privacy implications, that additional information collection, is the temptation to use that information. Andrea said early on, brought up the example that so this information is in a database, and you know, a jealous husband or jealous wife, you know, looks up the information, right? But we have to worry about more than that. You know, the governments that go errant. There's a real temptation, and remember that over time, you know, we've peeled back. There's been a peeling back of the sort of protections around our information in the name of anti-terrorism and in the name of controlling tax evasion and a whole bunch of other things. So there are the risks around collecting that additional information, or things around the use of that information, particularly when we're talking about location tracing for surveillance, the misuse by insurance folks. There's been, and think about, you know, in terms of outside of nefarious uses by governments, the courts have been loath to limit access to information that is critical to the decisions around somebody's liberty or even their civil rights. And so those can be some of the implications of giving up information that can be prejudicial to a person's interests.
I think that's quite insightful. But actually, I'd like to move the discussion shortly to you know, exploring sort of the technology and its applications for good. But before we do that, I want to get into another poll question for our audience. And so, is the trade-off to protect public health at the expense of individual privacy worth it? I think this will help guide sort of the next part of this discussion. Okay, so actually most people do think that the trade-off, 57% believe that the trade-off is actually worth it, which I think is quite interesting, and I'm gonna be curious on your thoughts on that in a second. But let's discuss how technology can be balanced in protecting the public interest and individual privacy. And so let's do another quick poll, and then we'll move into you know, some thoughts from Matt on this. And so we'd like to just do kind of a sort of pre sort of survey. So in your opinion, what has been the net impact of digital technologies over the last decade? Okay, so most people believe believe that I think about 90% are positive or strongly positive on the net impact of technologies over the last decade. And so, Matt, for you, do you see emerging technologies such as DLT playing a role in mitigating these risks?
Well, sure. And actually, you know, I came prepared with a contrary view because commas are super important. I had misread the title of Andrea's presentation to be "No Thanks to Blockchain" rather than "No Thanks to Blockchain." So our views will be substantially similar. Listen, here are the things that we think about in terms of contract tracing, right? And then the maintenance of privacy and why distributed ledger technology works, right? So the first is we're talking about a cheap and quick solution first, something that has to be nimble and easily deployed. And their DLT fits the bill a fair bit, right? They're out of the box, easy open source solutions to deploy. The next bit is that there has to be interoperability, right? So, you know, the point is we have to be able to share information across many different jurisdictions. Blockchain, distributed ledger technology helps us in that respect. You know, in terms of lack of trust, that's helpful, particularly when you're dealing with different jurisdictions that you might have less friendly views about. The transparency is critical in this aspect, right? The security around privacy, I mean, that's one of the key points, is security around the hash and around the sort of algorithms that are used and the tamper-proof nature, right? So meant to be immutable in most cases. Where the one facet that doesn't seem to work so well is, you know, many privacy constructs are built around the idea of being able to be forgotten, right? So that if you want to pull out of the system, or that you want your information to be forgotten, that's one of the downsides of the DLT, is it's hard to do. You might argue that the information wasn't truly associated with you in the first place because it's hard to identify a particular individual, but that's one of the failings.
Okay, and so, you know, how can this technology actually be leveraged, you know, given the current circumstances and discussions around public health and individual security?
Well, I think, Andrea laid out a fair case for the ideas about how we can obtain the information without it being uniquely identifiable, right? So tracing of locations without tracing an individual, with an individual being able to prove, though objectively, that a certain situation impacted him. The one counterpoint I'd love to throw to Andrea, though, is the idea that, although you can't work backwards from a hash, they're designed not to be able to be used in the opposite direction. I mean, there is the risk with multiple governments involved that you could run the information that you have against your entire data set and see which hash matches up. There are ways to reverse engineer, I think, just a counterpoint.
Okay. And actually, and I think that's quite interesting in being able to kind of look at it and not be able to sort of trace it in a reverse way. But I think what a lot of the audience and a lot of people are also wondering, and as you saw a little bit from the poll, with some people concerned about technology, can this technology be used in a negative way against the protection of privacy? And Matt, I'll look to you to answer that one.
Yeah, again, so, I guess that there is a huge incentive structure in place here, right? We have to think about the idea about what are the goals of the government involved, and if they move beyond the temptation of the sort of information that we're talking about is strong, and I suppose it depends on how the network is set up. I mean, we've seen the sorts of networks where if it's around a proof of work, that we've seen chains corrupted, right? And so by way of 50+1% attacks, more worrisome to me is the idea of quantum computing, where we're relying a lot on the idea that our encryption is infallible in these instances, and quantum computing does a handy job at making short work of those algorithms.
Okay, and so definitely there could definitely be some negative potential ways, but I think it sounds like they're a little far off maybe into the future, hopefully. But
yeah, no doubt, limited current issues, just things to think about.
Okay, perfect. That's reassuring. And so actually, I'm interested as well in your thoughts before we move over to Andrea into, if all of these things can manage personal data securely and privately, why are we not doing this yet?
Yeah, well, there seems to be a huge movement towards distributed ledger technology. There are some barriers for sure, right? Part of the problem is the awareness of the issues. Part of it is about apathy. I think there has been. I think the apathy has increased over time as we've had our privacy eroded by things like anti-terrorist measures and similarly, right? And so governments are slow to move on this. We're still, we've been talking in Canada for well over a decade about the adoption of just digital identities, and we can't seem to get down that road, and there just seems to be a lack of urgency around the issue.
Okay, and so it seems like there's some sorts of barriers on a government or even potentially regulatory side, which I think we'll get to shortly. But Andrea, we discussed blockchain, but what about other technologies? How do those come into play?
Okay, so Ali, let me just briefly comment on Matt's points, which are well taken. That I totally agree. In my presentation, obviously, was simplifying a bit, but it's true that, say, if your test result is yes and no, and you take a hash of yes, take a hash of no, and then an outside observer that only observe the hash will be easily figure out what is the hash of no and what is the hash of yes, of course. So then you have to add, you have to take your answer, so yes or no, and add a random number, which is called a nonce. And then this is why you take the hash of that, and then to an outside observer, it's harder to infer. But of course, in everything has to do with cryptography and encryption in general, it's always the case that if you throw enough computing power at the problem, you will be able to crack it. The question is, does the NSA want to know whether I am COVID positive or not? And if the answer is not, then probably I'm safe, okay? And then it's true, like quantum computing will require different techniques than the hash I discussed. And so I've simplified greatly, but there are other technological issues that are very important. I didn't have time to mention, and Matt rightly brought them up. Now to your question, so the discussion was framed in terms of blockchain because blockchain, in my view, is the low-hanging fruit. Managing third-party generated personal data with blockchain is something that I think by now it's well understood, and really we need to speed up its adoption. But indeed, there are other technologies that can help achieve this privacy, this balance between sharing data and keeping data private. One that comes to mind is everything has to do with zero knowledge proof and secure multi-party computation. These are cryptographic techniques that allow to perform operation on data that are always encrypted. And actually, with this respect, there is a very interesting startup founded by two inside Alon that have created the first zero knowledge, authentication using biometrics. Okay, so essentially, what you do is when you create an account on an app or on a website, you will upload an encrypted version of, say, your fingerprint scan. And every time you want to log in, you will again just show an encrypted version of your fingerprint scan or an encrypted version of your face. So the service you're trying to log in never see your face, never see your fingerprint, because everything is encrypted. Nonetheless, they're able, of course, you take a picture of your face, it's never going to be exactly the same. So you need techniques to be able to say whether two encrypted versions of the face of the person are indeed the same person. But then, you never have to show your face to the service you're trying to authenticate this. And there are similar techniques that are now being discussed, for example, for the purpose of contact tracing. One particular is called garbled circuits, where your trace is messed up in a way that switches location and time and therefore nobody is able to know where you were at a given time. Nonetheless, it's still possible to say that two persons were at the same place at the same time. But the problem with that is that, except for a few cases, such as the case of keyless I just described, they tend to be extremely computationally intensive. So although in principle it can be done, like I can tell you whether you two, Matt and Ali, were ever in the same place at the same time without ever knowing your history of your location, well, this is extremely computationally intensive and therefore cannot really apply to large scale. So although this is also a promising avenue of research, I think it's a little bit farther, it's a bit too far from being immediately implemented. It requires additional research.
I actually, found that quite fascinating, because the example that you gave about an INSEAD startup, Keyless, is a great example, I think, of a practical application, what we're talking about and how that can really be used. So that was quite fascinating. And looking at sort of as a quick sort of wrap to this section before we move into regulation, I think that the audience does believe, though, that the trade-off could be worth it. But I'm interested to see, does that evolve over time in terms of our audience's views? But really, blockchain here can be used for good. It can actually help to solve and maintain sort of that personal privacy that you mentioned and alluded to earlier, Andrea, as well as Matt. And so I'd like to actually move into the regulation piece and shortly get our audience's thoughts on a question. But human rights groups now worry about ground being ceded to the authorities in the name of public health and may not be regained once the crisis passes. We've seen some regimes use the pandemic to their own ends. Already, strongman leaders are capitalizing on the coronavirus to arrogate far-reaching powers to themselves. Is a world with less individual privacy and in some cases more government oversight the new normal? I know that's a question that I'm also worried about. And so for our audience, what is your outlook on privacy post-pandemic? Okay, so our audience is quite negative on the outlook of privacy post-pandemic. About 63% are negative or strongly negative. And keeping that in mind and staying on this point, Matt, on the outlook of privacy and human rights, do you think there is merit to the claims of some of the human rights groups? Is the temporary loss of privacy something that can become the new normal?
Yeah, no doubt. In my lifetime, this is the most unprecedented use of emergency powers, right? I mean, but what we're seeing is that the loss of life trumps the loss of liberty, and so in these instances, and while this continues, I expect that the privacy issues will persist and escalate. The question is, at what point could it abate when there is the constant argument that this could recur? And there's no question that it could.
And so, Matt, given your background as a renowned expert on identity, how do you see the role of government in safeguarding privacy?
I think it has to be paramount. I mean, the point is that as an individual, there's very little power. There's very little power you have against corporations, against governments, against, the point is that the government has to set the standards and has to set the safeguards particularly as we're talking about an international playing field, right? That we have to have a government help with the potential privacy implications of other governments. We have to help have governments help the masses protect themselves from the invasion of their privacy for any number of reasons.
Actually, so let's stay on that point. And with GDPR factoring into it, in Europe, for example, limiting these solutions or protecting individual data, for these use cases, I guess, how do you see that kind of come into play with GDPR and other sort of privacy regulations globally?
It's fascinating. I was looking at the guidance that a number of countries have put out about even workplaces, right? I mean, that's if we bring this down to a micro level, it's fun to think about how do we apply privacy in the workplace related to COVID? And you look at just France, and in France, employers aren't allowed to ask employees if they're infected. They're not allowed to ask them if they've traveled. They're not allowed to check their temperature. They're not allowed, so, and all as a consequence of the framework of GDPR. So, it's having significant impacts on the amount of information, even at that low level, that information that people can use to be able to protect themselves against people who are potentially infected.
Okay, I think that's, quite fascinating on kind of how France is approaching it. And I'd like to move to Andrea and then shortly to a poll question and then audience questions, which quite a few have been submitted. And so, Andrea, to what extent can and should responsible leadership be a substitute for government regulations and data protection? And also linked to that, should corporate or private sector leaders self-regulate the use of personal data by their organizations, and based on what considerations?
Well, I think responsible leadership can overcome some of the most glaring issues with privacy. For example, just pure databases being hacked, for example. This is a matter of responsible leadership. However, it's important to understand that this is imperfect. I think the ball rests with the regulator. Yeah, it's like Matt was saying, regulation is paramount. And the reason is that once data are collected, they will sit on this organization's server, during the tenure of the current leadership, which we think is very, trustworthy. But also the following one and the follower and the follower, and we do not know who will come in power, who will be handling our data in the future. So we may trust current leaders, we may trust current politicians, but I think it's important to understand that the lifespan of our data will go well beyond those leaders, and hence it's really about regulation. Those data, if not necessary, of course, if not necessary, just should not be collected at all. So to avoid that in the future, some less responsible leader comes in and creates problem using those data.
Absolutely. And so, with that, I would like to actually move over to a poll question. We're getting a little short on time, but we will have some time for a few questions from our audience. And so let's move to the poll question. What do you expect the net impact of digital technologies to be over the coming decade? That's quite interesting. So we've got, the audience does expect the net impact of digital technologies to be quite positive. It looks like it's about 85%. So, I think that I think is good based on your discussion and the discussion here about blockchain, as well as other technologies a little bit on how it can impact the situation. And so let's move over to some of the audience questions, and I'll open this both to you, Matt, as well as Andrea. And so how do you see the conversation of privacy and security evolving in the aftermath of COVID? And as part of that, is there a way to ensure that after this crisis is over, how governments can be prevented from misusing the personal data they gathered?
Well, I think, I think that, there will be an escalation of individuals' demand for methods like distributed ledger technology to control this information. I expect that's the way it's going to evolve, and I hope it is. Andrea?
Yes, so to me, it boils down to, because obviously during the period of crisis, privacy will go out of the window because we need to save life and we collect data that we need and we don't care about privacy. But of course, the crisis lasts, the pre-crisis and a post-crisis. So, and I think it's important, this also depends on how much work we can get done into trying to find privacy-preserving ways to contain the pandemic in the period pre and post the crisis, and how much can we get it in place for the next crisis, right? So this won't be solved during the crisis. This will be solved by working hard before the next crisis or before the next wave of pandemic.
Okay, and I think that's a good question, a response, I mean, to sort of how COVID will how personal data will essentially be evolved, and how governments can be prevented from misusing it, hopefully. And so another question that came in from our audience is, does guaranteed privacy equate to no permission required on data collection? If we disagree, then who is being protected by the lack of the data collection?
So, well, data are personal data here. So data here is not, the intensity of sun rays today. So this is always about someone's data. And of course, not collecting those personal data protects the person whose personal data you would otherwise collect. Okay. This person could be a person that, to give you an example, so suppose that today we are in a world where everyone has a Chinese-style contact tracing app in their pocket, also including the US, and you are considering whether to go out and protest for this Black Lives Matter movement that we saw in recent weeks. And now you may be worried that now the information that you joined the protest is stored on someone's server, in the government server. For the moment, it is only for the purpose of contact tracing, but there have been periods of American history where the FBI was keeping lists of alleged communist sympathizers, and who knows, 5-10 years down the road, maybe there will be lists somewhere of alleged Black Lives Matter sympathizer or alleged Antifa sympathizer, and you definitely don't want to be on those lists, okay? And so maybe you change your behavior because of that, or if you still do, you know that you're gonna, you take a risk. So we are protecting the people that will change their behavior or may get into trouble in 5, 10, 15 years down the road if those data are collected by doing something that is fully legal. So that's all the premise, because this is totally within their rights to go out and peacefully protest.
Absolutely, and so being conscious of time, we do have several questions still, that have been asked by the audience. Unfortunately, we only have Andrea and Matt here for the hour. And so we will have to wrap up, but I think this has been a very insightful discussion. Our audience is optimistic about the future of technology, helping to support, this sort of change while still being concerned about the current situation and how privacy is being used. And I think what we learned is technologies such as blockchain can be used to preserve privacy and protect the public. And so thank you for your time, Andrea and Matt. And
thank you, Ali.
Feedback. So a feedback email will be sent to all of the participants, and a video recording, the slides and further readings, including the knowledge article that you recently wrote, Andrea, will be shared. And there's a lot of great, webinars upcoming as well. And, you can definitely check them out. There's both the Tech Talk X series as well as other webinars, as you can see on the screen here. Be sure to join them and, hear from a number of leading experts and faculty from INSEAD. And so thank you so much for making the time, and hope to see you soon at one of the upcoming webinars.